instruments that are going to make a noise. Yeah. Our first speaker is my colleague and very good friend, Sydney-born Professor Suzanne Rutland, who's chair of the Department of Hebrew, Biblical and Jewish Studies and Faculty of Arts at the University of Sydney. Published widely on Australian Jewish history, including 7 books, many articles, chapters in books, entries, encyclopedias. And I must say her major history of Australian Jewry, The Edge of the Diaspora, 2 Centuries of Jewish Settlement in Australia, was first published in 1988 and has had 2 subsequent editions, is really the basic book for anybody to read who wants to understand a comprehensive and objective picture, well-researched, of the Australian Jewish community. And I think there's no other book that's appeared that comes anywhere near that. Her latest book is Jews in Australia, published by Cambridge University Press as part of their series on ethnic groups in Australia. And recently she received a major government grant together with Professor Sol Ensel to study the political sociology of Australian Jewry. Held many leadership positions, including past president of the Australian Jewish Historical Society. It's my pleasure now to call upon Professor Suzanne Rutland to address us.
Thank you, Eliyahu. I just have to check that is the mic working, because I know I've got a soft voice. Okay. I'll just get this working. Oh, what do I click on here first? F5. Great.
F5.
Doesn't want to go on for some reason. I'm sorry, but the technology does help, particularly when one only has 20 minutes to present on a very complex topic. As if it's going to fully work, otherwise we might have to have my text rather than seeing the full screen. I might start while we're waiting, just because of shortage of time. This is F5 here. Good. Firstly, I would also like to thank Professor Robert Wistridge for inviting me to address you at this conference. And he's asked me to speak about Australian multiculturalism, immigration, race and religion. And I want to stress that there are commonalities with the Australian story to what we've heard to date at this conference, but also some significant differences. I'm dividing my paper into 3 parts. The first part is going to look at the development of multiculturalism in Australia. The second part will look at how multiculturalism has affected the Jewish community, and the third part will focus on Muslims in Australia. On the first part, there is an absolute ton of academic material, research, government documents and so on the development of multiculturalism. The second part, on Jews and multiculturalism, there's also there's a fairly large amount of material appearing and continuing to appear. The third part, the issue of Muslims in Australia, is much more complex, and some of the issues that I'll be touching on in my paper, which I think are relevant to the theme of anti-Semitism, to date have not been researched within the academic framework in Australia. Obviously, my research is starting. We and my colleague, Professor Sol Ensel, the top sociologist, hope to fill that gap as part of our present research project. So, if I look then at the development briefly of Australian multiculturalism, Australian migration policies, when Australia federated in 1901, were very monocultural. As the cartoon, which you can see there, illustrates, the thing which brought the various Australian colonies together was their desire to exclude Asian migrants. A policy was brought in that became known as the White Australia policy, that operated from 1901 to 1939, that aimed to totally exclude not only Asians but also Europeans, who were largely defined as aliens. That policy only changed during the period of World War II, when Australia was faced with the imminent threat of a Japanese invasion. a threat which only did not materialize thanks to the American Navy in the Battle of the Coral Seas when the Japanese were pushed back. But the threat of Japan taking over all Australia led to a radical change in Australian migration policy. In 1944, a government subcommittee decided that after the war, migration to Australia was to be encouraged as much as possible, and that whilst Britain was still to be the main source of migrants for Australia, for the first time Europeans were to be encouraged. Now, as we'll see from the image in the next slide, the new Australian was still ideally to be the British, as we can see here, the Australian reaching out to Britain to try and bring as many British migrants to Australia in the post-war period. It's a wonderful image. But in point of fact, Australia was unable to attract enough British migrants to fit the target of 200,000 migrants a year, and therefore the government looked for an alternative source, and that was found among the DPs in Europe. And I have to stress the non-Jewish DPs, the displaced persons. Jews were excluded from the displaced persons program of the International Refugee Organisation. That's a different lecture. I've published on it. Anyone who wants to hear or read my article can ask me after today's presentation. The IRO program brought to Australia 200,000 displaced persons from Europe between 1947 and 1950. It was a radical change in Australian migration policy. And while in 1949 the Labor Party, which brought that policy in, was defeated in the elections, the Liberal government, which came in after Labor, maintained that same migration policy. So between 1949 and 1972, a huge number of migrants from different parts of Europe, including Italy, Greece, Germany, Holland, substantial mass migration programs, brought very large numbers of migrants to Australia. Indeed, today in Australia, at least 50% of Australians are first generation or second generation Australians. So we have a radical change. However, Asians were still excluded. And the change in terms of Asian migration only came when the Labor Party was re-elected after 23 years in the political wilderness. And the man who led that election was Whitlam. He led it with the electoral message, It's Time. And Whitlam radically changed the whole face of Australia. The first thing he did was to recognise Communist China. He removed the White Australia policy, and for the first time Asians were permitted to migrate to Australia. In 3 years, he also brought in policies that included support of multiculturalism. The First Minister, Al Grasby, himself Italian, Italian-born, as the First Minister of Multiculturalism. He brought in funding for non-government schools. It was a radical sea change. Interestingly, his successor, Malcolm Fraser, who actually has some Jewish ancestry, his father was, his mother was the daughter of Perth Jews, but Fraser was strongly Anglican in terms of his religious affiliation. Fraser really greatly reinforced what Whitlam did. Even while initially he criticised Whitlam for recognising China, Fraser was fairly soon followed Whitlam to visit China, to build up links with Asia and to foster multiculturalism, very strongly so. Now, where did the Jewish community stand on all that? Initially, the Australian Jewish community was a little bit unsure about multiculturalism. In particular, the Jewish community in Sydney was not enthusiastic. They wanted to define themselves as Jews by religion and not Jews by ethnic origin. As you heard, I'm a Sydneyite. Eliyahu is from Melbourne. Melbourne took a slightly different stance and saw advantages in multiculturalism, particularly due to the role of Walter Lippmann. I'm sure Eliyahu couldn't speak a lot on Walter. He was one of the leading Australian Jewish figures. He became very active. He was a member of the Labor Party. Whitlam chose him to head one of the first multicultural committees for the Commonwealth Government. And so very quickly the whole of Australian Jewish community came to support multiculturalism. Now the question is, what is multiculturalism good for the Jews? I would argue very strongly that multiculturalism has been very good for the Jews of Australia. It has brought some very strong benefits. Firstly, the rapid growth of Jewish day schools, particularly in the 1970s, largely or certainly possible first because multiculturalism made the development of your own ethnic culture and religion much more acceptable in Australia. So while Anglo-Jews had feared separate Jewish day schools, suddenly it was acceptable to send your child to a Jewish school. Government funding came in and continues to be a very key source of financial support for Jewish schools in Australia. The government introduced ethnic radio, so government funds paying for Yiddish and Hebrew programs. There was support for cultural pluralism. Over the last few decades, important legislation against racial vilification and anti-discrimination legislation has been brought in. I know that you people have the ACTA publication from Danny Ben Moshe in your folders about Holocaust denial in Australia, particularly the Adelaide Institute and Dr. Frederick Tobin, also Olga Scully. Important court cases were brought before the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, and both Tobin and Scully were found, their case was found against through legal action, and they were ordered to remove their offensive material. As well, there's been respect for Jewish practices, so efforts by animal liberationists to end shechita have failed. In recent years, the Eruv, the fence to create a boundary for Shabbat, has been established in Melbourne, in Sydney and Perth with support from government institutions. So multiculturalism has definitely been good for the Jews. As Dr. Geoffrey Levy, one of the scholars on Australian multiculturalism, wrote in a recent book on Jews and Australian politics, the salad bowl of multiculturalism has strengthened Jewish identity in Australia. But at the same time, there has been a worrying phenomenon, because at the time when we see a rapid growth and strengthening of multiculturalism, the Jewish community since 1989 has also experienced an ongoing increase of anti-Semitic attacks, as can be seen from this graph produced by Jeremy Jones of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. It's unclear whether this increase in anti-Semitic incidents is due to right-wing extremist groups or religious extremism. I would argue that it's a factor of both. But whatever the cause, it has placed a huge security burden on the Jewish community, and the Jewish community has to pay for security. The government is not funding those that activity. And as the police officer in charge of the eastern suburbs said 2 years ago at a function that I attended, the Australian Jewish community is terrorist target #1 in Australia. So there is worrying issues. So now, how does the Jewish experience compare with the Muslim experience? There's no doubt that Muslims, and I want to stress it's largely Arab Muslims, have been much less successful in integrating in Australia at every level, economically, culturally, educationally and socially. One needs to differentiate. I think it's really important not to tar all Muslims with one brush. And indeed, the experience in Australia shows that different Muslims from different ethnic groups actually have their own mosques. There's often tensions between the different groups. The picture is not a unanimous one. One also has a situation with someone like Sheikh Hilaili, who's in the picture there, who when he came in the 1980s said some radically anti-Semitic things, particularly in a major talk he gave at my university, the University of Sydney. Hilaili has learnt to moderate his language, at least publicly. So one has to be careful in terms of dealing with and discussing Muslims. Factors in Australia such as halal meat, wearing the hijab, even the child law, are not issues. School children are permitted to wear the hijab. Muslim women wear it at universities. It's not like France, where there's been any move to Australia is multicultural and accepts all traditions. So just briefly to look at the growth of Muslims in Australia from the population point of view, I have two graphs here. On this side here we can see the population growth. In 1947 there were virtually no Muslims in Australia at a time when there were about 40,000 Jews in Australia. By 1971 the Jewish population had increased to 60,000, the Muslim population was only 20,000. So it was really Gulf Whitlam's change in 72 that led to a rapid growth of Muslims, and we can see that by 1996 there were 200,000. In the 2001 census, the latest census, there are 380,000. The unofficial Muslim sources actually put that number closer to 500,000, just as the Jewish census population is 80,000, but official Jewish sources would put it at least at 105,000. And similarly, you can see the growth of percentage of the population from Muslims being virtually nothing in 47 to now being 1.5% of Australia's population. So why have Muslims not been so successful in integration? First problem is attitudes to women. I'll go through these quickly. There are problems right across the Muslim world, that women marry early, that women who are observant are not permitted to work after they're married, very high fertility rates, low educational standards. The attitudes to bank loans, which I think no one has mentioned to date at this conference, but it's a major factor in integration into Australia because the Australian norm is to own your own home. And about 70% of Australia's population owns their own home. And that goes across all the ethnic groups apart from the Muslims. The problem with Islam is it has a taboo on what they call usury. So observant Muslims are not allowed to take out home loans, and therefore only about 10% of the Muslim population in Australia presently owns their own home. And we've mentioned already the issues of Sharia law and other customary law and norms. Now the interesting thing with Muslims is that they are both victims and victimizers. And I'll try and deal again with this fairly quickly. During both Gulf Wars, the early 1990s and then after September 11, and then the Muslims have been very much under attack in Australia, particularly women have been abused, mosques desecrated, schools and children are targets. There have been vicious comments on radio. And of course this attack on Muslims was very much seen in the recent Cronulla riots, which took place in December 2005 in the Sydney beachside suburb. You can see there Aussie Pride, White Pride, that's a neo-Nazi type group. The Muslims who were attacked were vicious. It was a vicious, violent attack. And the Muslims did not really do anything initially at that point to sponsor the attack. At the same time, however, there are broader issues and problems with Muslims, again, which I think are common in other parts of the world. Muslims also can be victimizers. There's problems of gang rape. In a recent case, 4 young Pakistani men claimed that they did not realise it was unacceptable to rape women because they see women in Western dress and they think they can do anything they like. There have been a lot of instances of physical and verbal abuse, and it's not a lot because very few Jews live in the area where Muslims are concentrated, but where it's happened both Jewish children and also where there's been Jewish teacher, where they've found out that they're Jewish, they've suffered from attacks. And I recently interviewed an Asian teacher in one of these schools who went at the beginning of the year to do the Yad Vashem course. And I'm just going to read out to you just a couple of quotes from that interview of what his students say in a Muslim government school in western suburbs of Sydney, where approximately 30% of the school population are Muslim. So one type of thing is a student of Lebanese Druze background has said to the teacher, a little bit out of the blue, "I don't know about these Jews, I just hate them." The teacher just could not get the student to go beyond that point. Discussing authority in the state, one student said, "Yeah, that's just like George Bush. It's a Jew." "Oh, really?" "Yeah, Jew who worships the devil. Jew that worships Babylon." "Really? That's not true." "Yeah, come on, sir. It is true, isn't it?" This, I can give you many more examples of the Jew hatred that appears to be representing itself among Muslim children in schools in the western suburbs. And this is very much fostered by material sold in the Muslim bookshops. For example, this is just one example of a children's game. You can see the aim is to conquer Jerusalem, and you can see the elements of hate, violence in that game. Just recently, the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions and the Australian Federal Police ruled that the police could not take action against any of this material from the Muslim bookshops. Perhaps even more disturbing is what's happening on campuses, particularly through the activities of Hizbut Tahrir, the extremist Muslim group. On my own campus at the University of Sydney, the president last year of Hizbut Tahrir the president was a member of Hizbut Tahrir. His name is Usman Badar, and at the time, and this again is from an interview from a student who was actually a Muslim student from our campus, who was actually there after the London bombings in July 2004. July 2005, and Badar, who's 21 years old, Pakistani descent, went to the Muslim school Malik Fahad, and was one of the top students in his year. His sermon said, and I'm now quoting from the interview, the general gist of Usman's sermon was that the attacks were really a retaliation for what is happening in Palestine and Iraq, and it is bringing the war home to those who are funding it. In other words, he justified the suicide bombers. My interviewee said, "I did a sermon after the second attack, and mine was more about general principles of morality. It was highly criticised and considered to be inappropriate, given that it really should have been supporting the attack and speaking about why the attack was a good thing and not a bad thing." That's at the University of Sydney. At mosques, there is the problem of the Islamist jihadist firebrands speaking, and also sermons that just demonise. It's replacement theology, but in a Muslim context, demonising Jews and Judaism. And as a result of that, and I've already mentioned the security problems for Jews with individual attacks. There have been some recent arrests of Muslims. One case, Jack Roach, who was a Muslim convert. Here we have Abu Bakr, one of 15 Muslims, arrested for planned terrorist attacks. It's interesting to stress that it's Arab Muslims, not Arab Christians. Indeed, the governor of my state, New South Wales, Mary Bashir, is a Lebanese Christian. There's been a very strong debate in the Parliament. It's in my abstract, so I'll just go through it quickly. The Liberal Party, the government of Australia at the moment, has taken a fairly strong stand, and as Peter Costello said, if those are not your values, if you want a country which has Sharia law or a theocratic state, then Australia is not for you. This statement was strongly attacked by the Labor Party, with John Faulkner, a Labor senator, claiming this assault on Australian values by Mr Howard and his ministers is all about turning Australians of Muslim faith into this generation's bogeymen for cheap political gain. So in conclusion, the multicultural, I believe that the multicultural policy supported in Australia since the 1970s has been a very positive one. And I think the Jewish community has really benefited. I think the dilemma, and it's not just an Australian dilemma, it's a worldwide dilemma, is the problem is, what do you have when you have one group, one minority ethnic culture? And I want to stress, I'm not talking about all Muslims. I think the group that is threatening, and I've still got to do more research on them, is Wahhabi Islam, coming from Saudi Arabia, and as I understand it from some of my interviews in Australia, the problem is that a lot of the funding for Muslim institutions comes from Saudi Arabia supporting Wahhabism, and therefore the institution receiving the funding has to take that line of argument. And Wahhabism, groups like Hizbut Tahrir, are rejecting multiculturalism. They are actually refusing to accept the core values of the country, and they are actually arguing against multiculturalism, not for it. So the dilemma is to how to deal with that type of group where their mores actually clash with mainstream Australian mores. And as I said, I think that's a situation with the recent, and not all Arab Muslims, but those Arab Muslims who are exposed, whether you want to call it an Islamist theology or Wahhabism, it still is a huge problem. It needs to be dealt with strength, with a government policy that's prepared to be critical of that, but also through, I believe, more targeted educational programs, and also dialogue, working with moderate Muslims, because I think that unless we empower moderate Muslims to have a voice, then we won't be able to deal with the more radical elements of Islam. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief of Police. He moved to Israel in 1981. He's a founding member of the ecological village of Leon in the Elah Valley in central Israel, where he grows olives. I have pleasure in welcoming Ari O'Sullivan to address us.
It's interesting you mentioned olives. Yesterday somebody uprooted 50 olive trees of mine, which sort of reminds me of the biblical character that simple life has in this country sometimes. First of all, I want to thank Professor Wistrich. Kenny Jacobson, who is the Associate Director of the ADL in America, truly regrets he could not make it to this lecture. He thanks you for inviting him to write a speech which I will be delivering. And as you know, the ADL, if you saw your programs, are supporting the lecture now. And many of you think ADL is an American organization. We also have a presence in Israel, a very strong presence in Israel, and I invite you all to pick up a copy there. I thought we'd start off this with a quick 2-minute video.
If you're a Republican or Democrat, no problem. If you're third party, you are run through the ringer, as if your voice doesn't count, which recently the Michigan press reported that it seems that the democratic system is not working for middle-class America. And I reiterate, in fact, it isn't. We carry the world on our backs. The enemy in opposition to us is the enemy of all the people of the world, regardless of nations or races. They preach their democracy in Nepal in support of a communist insurrection, officially by the United States government. They sent me and my peers to Vietnam, and then they stabbed us in the back. We of the National Socialist Movement recognize the right of all peoples to exist. But what people does not recognize the right of all peoples to exist? And I will tell you in one word: Jews! 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 They claim the world is theirs. Their God gave them the world. Where does that leave you? I appreciate your immigrants to do the same.
Okay, enough. It goes on. A typical Sunday afternoon in Lansing, Michigan, of multiculturalism and of freedom of speech.
Not a big crowd.
At a conference, it gets better actually, or worse. At a conference entitled Modern European Antisemitism, Multiculturalism and Identity Politics, an examination of such issues in America immediately suggests several questions. How much of the anti-Semitism related to multiculturalism in Europe is manifest in America as well? Where and why is America different? And if America is different, what, if anything, can be learned by Europeans about the American experience, which may be useful to ease the intensity of the problem? America is not immune from the problems that have been the central theme of this conference. It's fascinating that a conference looking at the condition of Jews today outside of Israel, as this one, focuses only marginally on America. Fascinating, but also understandable if the subject is anti-Semitism. American Jewry, in so many ways, are the center of the diaspora life, politically, financially, demographically, culturally. But when it comes to the subject of anti-Semitism, America is hardly the first place to look. However, recently efforts have surfaced in certain mainstream U.S. circles to blame Jews for the war in Iraq, to blame the Israeli lobby for controlling American Middle East policy in order to serve the interests of Israel against those of America, and to single out Israel for economic punishment. And as a result, it is clearer than ever that there is no reason to be complacent even in the United States. And because American Jews are so critical, not only for the future of Jews living outside of Israel, but also to American-Israeli relations, any potential for any increase in anti-Semitism in America would be highly significant. Some of the problems of multiculturalism, identity politics, and anti-globalization that we've heard about in Europe are clearly present in America. Of course, multiculturalism can be defined in many ways and can take many forms. In its most positive form, as Anthony Lerman has recently described, it can be a way of preserving and promoting culture, diversity, and respecting differences. And at the same time, working for social cohesion and not cultural relativism. It can value the contributions each community can make to the whole and can create a climate in which maintaining Jewish distinctiveness is an expression of society's common agenda. Too often, however, particularly in Europe, but even in certain sectors of the American society, an extreme form of this phenomenon surfaces and may even be prominent in school curricula, university settings, and ethnic political settings. This form is characterized by 1, the pillaring of the West as imperialist, racist, capitalist, and 2, the denial of any responsibility by minorities for their own problems, resulting in blame and scapegoating of others. And 3, the advancement of certain minorities against others who are perceived as part of the oppressors. When this approach predominates, Jews are excluded from the category of multiculturalism and many times can be the target of multiculturalists. When Jews are excluded from the multicultural agenda, that can lead to several variations that can become a syndrome. It can result in the notion that when Jews are attacked for the support of the racist Zionist state, they do not deserve particular protection. It can mean that when one looks at the history and needs of different groups that have been victims, Jews need not be counted. And in its worst form, it can lead to out-and-out anti-Semitism. Peter F. Langman, in his book Jewish Issues in Multiculturalism, describes the factors that can lead to the exclusion of Jews from the multicultural agenda. He says that Jews, quote, are seen as an assimilated non-minority, end quote. They are seen as economically privileged. They are seen as part of a white majority. They don't fit certain definitions of oppression, of racism, of economic deprivation. Indeed, often Jews are depicted as being on the other side. How can they be part of the oppressed minority when they have so much success, so much access to power, so much education, so much whiteness? If institutionalized racism is the problem, Jews can be seen as part of the problem and not part of the solution. This goes to what, in my view, is distinctive and so lethal about anti-Semitism as a form of bigotry. While sharing many things in common with other manifestations of hatred, racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, the unique core of anti-Semitism is the theory of the conspiratorial, all-powerful, poisonous Jew. This focus on this insidious, creeping Jewish power particularly suits the pattern of some who want to see their problems as the oppressed, victimized by the evils of institutionalized power. Here, Jews can surface in the strangest places. So when Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam seek to address the historical wrong of American slavery, it's not a true reckoning to the link with the white Anglo-Saxon establishment. Behind it are the Jews who dominated the slave trade. And this is despite the paucity of the Jewish presence in the colonial America. Or if the Palestinians become the embodiment of victimhood of the East by the West, it suits not only the anti-American bias that exists in such quarters, but perfectly meshes with anti-Semitic notions of Jewish power. In that respect, both the charges by congressmen before the war in Iraq that neoconservative Jews were the power behind bringing the United States to war, and the recent paper by University of Chicago Professor John Mearsheimer and Harvard Professor Stephen Walt claiming that the Israeli lobby controls American Middle East policy to serve Israel at America's expense, these fall on fertile soil in certain multicultural circles. Assumptions that Israel and or Jews cannot be victims or represent the oppressive values of the West are factors of on a number of campuses around the country, though again nothing in comparison to what's going on in universities in Europe. Some Middle East programs are purveyors of such attitudes. Recently at Penn State University, a Jewish student's artistic exhibit criticizing Arab terrorism was deemed harassment of a minority. Meanwhile, criticism of Jews supporting Israel is often deemed as free speech. We had an example of free speech. Efforts to diverse university funds from companies doing business in Israel have been mounted in some of America's top schools, but have not gotten anywhere because the presidents have rejected this bigotry against Israel. The Palestinian Solidarity Movement has held several conferences in an effort to generate boycotts of Israel, but they too have had limited impact. Off campus, there are manifestations as well. The Presbyterian Church has mounted a campaign for divestment from Israel. Here too, despite the fears of a contagion spreading to other churches, it has not taken off, and the Presbyterians are reconsidering their campaign in a national meeting which is going on right now. Similarly, it is no accident that when anti-war demonstrations were taking place in the last few years against American involvement in Iraq, the anti-globalization movement called Answer featured attacks on Israel similar to those against America. And having focused briefly on the dangerous manifestations of multiculturalism in America, which resonate with many of you who deal primarily with Europe, I need to talk about why America is different, what we call American exceptionalism, why those negative manifestations are kept within certain parameters in America, unlike Europe, and why the positive elements of a multicultural approach have a far greater chance to predominate. There are many reasons why America is different, and it begins with a question: what does it mean to be an American? The question was asked even before America declared its independence. Thinkers realized early on that something new and different was emerging in America. People were coming from different nations, states, were settling together, were becoming part of a new whole, or many new wholes. And this meant there was automatically a fluid sense of identity on many levels which did not exist in Europe. Listen to J. Hector St. John de Crevecoeur, writing in Letters from an American Farmer in 1793. How do you say? Sorry. Quote, "What then is the American, this new man? He is an American who is leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds. Here, individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of man, where labors and prosperity will one day cause great changes in the world. The Americans, therefore, ought to love this country much better than that wherein either he or his forefathers were born." And we can remember the Pilgrims landing on the Mayflower 400 years ago, I'm not sure the first thing they said was, hey, let's find some Jews we can get along with. It's taken a long time. And ever since, there have been many different answers to the questions of who is an American. The multicultural answer is the latest. All are premised on the notion that one did not have to be born in America to be an American. One did not have to be of a particular religion or come from one place to become an American. All of which forced Americans early on to address the issues of both unity and diversity. How to keep a sprawling nation with so many different people and religious perspectives together as one nation, and while there was a dominant culture and group later known and identified as the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, how to give legitimacy and expression to the diverse cultures and customs that were characterized of each ensuing immigrant population. In Europe, Jews have taken hits from both the concept of unity and the concept of diversity. Historically, a united nation generally meant it unites religiously and ethnically, which led to exclusion, discrimination, and violence against the Jews. And, as this conference has been assessing, the rise of diversity has produced a phenomenon in which Israel and Jews have become the targets of Muslim groups supported by left-wing ideologies. Not so in America, where both unity and diversity have given legitimacy to Jews. And so evolved different theories and approaches, even while such forces as nazism and racism led to laws and violence toward different ethnic groups. The concept of being an American as fundamentally different from European definitions of identity and nationhood remained. In the 20th century, 3 stages of development in understanding the relationship between unity and diversity developed. Along the way, there was a movement away from the unity of people and towards the diversity pole, without, however, abandoning the overriding theme of unity. First came the melting pot theory of America, the notion that every new immigrant melts into an existing American stew, changing it slightly with additional ingredients, but leaving the basic makeup of United America. The focus here was mostly on the new immigrant adjusting to the mores of America. Then came the idea of cultural pluralism, where the cultural differences became more central to Americans. This concept compared America to an orchestra, which each group played its own instrument, while together they produced beautiful euphonics music. In many ways, cultural pluralism represents the ideal for American Jews. It does nothing to weaken the goal of American unity and American values, which have provided unique opportunities for Jews, but it also defines Americanness in a way that Jews can feel completely equal while expressing and living their particular cultural and religious values. More recently, multiculturalism has shifted the paradigm of unity and diversity somewhat more to the diversity side. And by questioning the values of Western culture, this may pose a threat to the unity of America. Still, the overwhelming thrust in society is the openness to become a full-blown American. This has now expanded to people of color from different nations of the world. The power of this idea mitigates the worst manifestations of multiculturalism. In one New York school, it is said that 130 languages are spoken. The city takes pride in this because they represent people all looking to make it in America. The notion that there are special obstacles and prejudices against the people, whether Africans, Asians, Muslims, or Hindus, is alive but far weaker than the desire to become an American. Therefore, the tendencies in multiculturalism and to balkanization toward denigration of the West, towards criticism of the majority culture and history, are not nearly as powerful as they are in Europe. There are other factors as well that lessen the impact of the worst features of multiculturalism. Church-state separation, American style, not the French or the Turkish style, provides an ample room for the religious sphere protecting religion from government intrusion or from control of the government while encouraging religious expression. This balance is one more example of the unity and diversity theme, which gives respect to different religions, including Judaism, while creating a broad, neutral sphere in which all peoples can participate. Muslim Americans, in other words, can find space in this system, as have had Jews, without resorting to radicalism. But one cannot ignore demography. Muslims in America, though growing, are a very small minority compared to the huge groups like African Americans, Hispanics, and other Asian groups. As the recent immigration debate indicated, the issue of America, unlike Europe, is hardly, will America be Islamicized? But how do we deal with millions of illegal immigrants from Mexico? A difficult challenge, but not one per se that threatens Jews. And then there is the American public opinion vis-a-vis Israel and Jews. Unlike Europe, the American public, both people who identify themselves as conservatives and those who say they're liberals, though conservatives more so, overwhelmingly support Israel. A recent Gallup poll has Americans sympathizing with Israel over the Palestinians by 4-1. In ADL polls in Europe, every country sympathized with the Palestinians. And while anti-Semitic attitudes have not disappeared, particularly among African Americans and Hispanics, and on the question of Jewish loyalty, they are still a far cry from Europe. So the public in America is not so receptive to negative messages about Israel or the Jews. In sum, the environment in America is far less conducive to the negative implications of extreme multiculturalism. Even when there are negatives, there sometimes can work positively. I think of the Black Power and Pride movement of the 1960s and 70s, which had an anti-Semitic quotient to it that was troubling. On the other hand, it had as well a beneficial impact on the willingness of Jews to publicly identify. Jews, in effect, said if blacks can be proud of who they are, then why can't Jews? And so it is now common to see Jews with kippot everywhere, and a certain at-easeness has emerged. What can be learned by Europe from the American experience? The histories are so different, the demographics are so different that one is inclined to say, not much. Still, the models of unity and diversity in America and how they have played out may be instructive for adaptation. Unity has not meant conformity, and diversity has not meant disintegration or hostility to the values of the whole. To change all of this in Europe requires leadership from government, intellectual circles, and the Muslim community. Whether all parties are capable or willing is uncertain, but the result, either way, will have a great impact on the Jews of Europe. Finally, I began by talking about not being complacent even about the situation in America. Antisemitism is a strange beast. It rises at unexpected times and unexpected places. It is unique among the various forms of hatred because it rests in the idea that Jews are not what they seem to be. And therefore, anti-Semitism can be summoned to explain any serious crisis in society, as the blame the Jews for the war in Iraq syndrome demonstrates. And so we keep up our guard and speak out, and hopefully with credibility and impact, even here in America.
Thank you, Amir. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions, discussion. Anybody is ready to start off and address your question to either of the two speakers? Yes?
This is directed to Professor Rutland.
Would you use it, please?
Hi, this is primarily directed at yourself. With all due respect, I don't know the situation of multiculturalism in Australia, but what I mean, my own personal beliefs anyway, but especially what's been reinforced here, over this conference, is that the state's involvement with religions, with cultures, with people of diverse origin, has invariably gone terribly wrong. When you talk about what's happened in Europe, you talk about the terrorist cells that are involved in 9/11. The vast majority of people involved in, say, the Spanish, the London, the New York attacks, were living in the welfare state, endorsed by the sort of the multicultural backed, particularly European or Canadian governments. So they weren't involved in the real world of actually sort of integrating with other people, with Jews, Christians, in those sort of countries. Now, like I said, with all due respect, I don't really know the situation in Australia, but you seem to like what you see as far as the Australian government paying for public radio, where for Hebrew programs and stuff like that, and you like the benefits that you get in the sort of the state schools, where the Jewish schools paid for by the state. But is this not maybe a little earlier on, like compared to, say, Europe in the 70s when things were fairly quiet for the Europeans? Is this not a little earlier on in the stage where things are going to go horribly wrong in Australia, just as they have in Europe, because of this uber non-judgmentalism? And yeah, sure, the Jews, I'm not Jewish myself, but the Jews in Australia have benefited from several government programs, and yet is it not going to end in tears eventually? Because the nature, the demographic size and the nature of the lobbying of Muslim cultures invariably extracts a huge amount more power and more money from government programs than the Jews, who are invariably too involved in working.
Okay. This is also for the professor. About the anti-Semitism in Australia, you mentioned the influence among Muslims of Wahhabi. I would assume that there's also the influence of the various Arab satellite programs that most of them receive, and those who have come from, let's say, from Lebanon. There are a lot of Lebanese in Australia. They brought their anti-Semitism or anti-Israeli sentiments with them, and of course it's reinforced with what they get both from the mosques and also from again the satellite. And then I was just wondering, how do the different groups of Australian Jews react to it? I mean, in addition to the native-born or those who are there for a long time, you have sort of silent Jews. Those have not really identified so much with the community. The Russian Jews, many of them Russian by way of Israel or via Israel, and then the Israeli Jews who sort of keep to themselves. And for both you and RAA, would you tend to say that when it comes to attacking Jews, it's much easier to attack Jews, let's say, the part of various minorities who resent the Jews, as you say, they sort of have gotten up and they feel that they have attained everything, because when you attack the Jews, you're attacking whitey, but you're not really hurting yourself or feeling the flank, because you're not attacking the mainstream Christians. Thank you.
Okay, the first question about multiculturalism. I think Australia's fairly different from probably the European scene in the large number of ethnic groups that have come to Australian shores since 1945. And so, as I said, majority of Australians are either only second or third generation. There were 7.5 million Australians in 1945. Today there are 20 million. We've had massive migration from different parts of Europe, Asia, as well as from the Middle East. So all of the other, I work with a demographer, Dr. Gary Eckstein, who's commented that all of the other ethnic groups, apart from one ethnic group, which is the Arab Muslims, have actually integrated within a generation into the Australian mores. So I think that what one has to do is have a look at one particular group which is having problems, and not say that the whole multicultural policy is wrong, because I mean, Jews are only less than 0.5% of the population, as I showed you, but the Greeks, the Italians, and the Indonesians and Malaysians, Chinese, it's a very rich tapestry that we have in Australia. The salad bowl. We have one group that's problematic, and that problem has to be dealt with. And there is a problem of some denial, some of the things which have been said by other people in other sessions. There's a commonality. There's a commonality of a culture of hate which is being developed by some Muslim groups in Australia. But that doesn't mean that one has to say all of multiculturalism is wrong. What it means is you've got to look at that one particular group, all of whom are on, a very high proportion of whom are on government welfare, are not working. Part of that socio-economic problem, but I think there needs to be stronger action taken in terms of education programs which specifically target these children that hold these myths. The teacher who I quoted wanted his Asian teacher. He went to Israel at the beginning of this year to do the course at Yad Vashem because he was so disturbed by the level of anti-Semitism going on in his school. He's trying on a one-to-one basis to counter the myths which these kids believe in. But he's one teacher. What's needed is a much broader educational policy taken on by the governments in Australia. So I think that there can be, I mean, to some extent, the speaker this morning was it Dr. Gerstenfeld said, we have to muddle through. Australia is faced with the same dilemmas as Europe, as I'm sure Islam, radical, the Islamists in America, or Wahhabism, or whichever term you wish to use, is also challenging America. And certainly the Twin Towers showed that. But there's a specific problem here that should be dealt with. It's a global problem that needs to be dealt with at a range of levels. But that's not to say that the whole of fostering cultural diversity is a wrong or inappropriate response. In terms of how to, the Jewish community, it's hard to talk about Australian Jewry. Of course, we have leadership and we have the leadership program. One of the things that the Jewish community in Australia is trying to do is to foster dialogue between Muslims and Jews. That's happening very effectively. Among those groups of Muslims, there's a group called Affinity. It's largely Turkish Muslims. There's excellent dialogue going on between the Turks and between the Jewish community. Individual groups, the Russians are very, Russian Jews are very nationalistic, as the gentleman mentioned. A lot of them have come via Israel. I think the newer migrant groups are as much concerned with recreating and re-establishing life in Australia as being involved with the leadership. I think this is an issue which the Jewish leadership needs to deal with very seriously. I think Jew hatred within radical Islam is a serious threat to the Jews in Australia, as it is elsewhere, even if it's only a small minority. But it's a Jewish leadership issue, and I think that can't be done by Jews alone. I think can only be done in collaboration with interfaith work, with government agencies and so on.
Let me just address the question about the impunity of attacking Jews in America. I have a result of last year's audit of anti-Semitic attacks. To put it into perspective, there was a decline last year in anti-Semitic attacks in America. There were 1,757 anti-Semitic attacks, and not one of them was a physical attack. The ADL is an organization that deals with trying to enact hate crime legislation. What you saw today, the freedom of speech includes, freedom of speech in America includes incitement, general incitement. The only way you can stop it is if it's specifically incitement to attack at that very moment, a very person that you see there. If you say to somebody, go burn that mosque down, go burn the synagogue down, that's not illegal. So these are some of the things that, for example, the ADL is working on to make it a crime to attack a Jew, as you say.
Any more questions? Well, on your behalf, I want to thank the two speakers. I think we had a very, very interesting and comprehensive survey of problems in other parts of the world. Thank everybody here, and I think are we breaking for coffee? There's a coffee break, and then we will continue. Toda rabah.